Hello students, today we will take up another story which is titled as The Inspector of Schools, and the author of this story is Mr. M. Atahar Tahir. He is giving you description of the condition of village schools, and it is very realistic and true to life. Even today we see that the conditions of the schools is just the same as the description of the school in the story. This is what still happens in many villages of the subcontinent, that is India. Education is considered an indulgence in the countries of the poor, yet it is the only way in which a society can progress towards awareness and development. The schools are essential for the development of any country. Amidst this callous indifference of the social system on one hand and of the government on the other are two individuals seriously committed to education. Both the schoolmaster and the inspector, which you will read in this story, both of them are dedicated to the cause, the purpose of education. The schoolmaster carries on his task. He teaches in the worst possible conditions, and the inspector walks miles into the interior in order to inspect the schools under his jurisdiction. So both of them are committed towards their duties. His own helplessness depresses him, for he realizes that his recommendations will serve no purpose. Independence hasn't made any difference. Even after getting independence, the condition of the schools have not changed. The schoolmaster is similarly unhappy at his own inability to further the cause. He wants to do something, but he is helpless, and he has to continue teaching in the worst of the conditions. Now you will read that the inspector, whose work is to inspect the schools, the government run schools, and he goes to distant places. Here you will see the inspector. He is come to inspect a school in a village, and he inquires about the school. The villagers inform him there is a school somewhere outside the village, and the streets, as we all know, which lead to the villages are bumpy, muddy, where the water from the flanking mud houses trickle out, and dusty. Suddenly it ended and the field started. The inspector, he began walking down the damp track between the fields, and in a distance he saw a cyclist coming his way. He inquires from the cyclist, where is the school? And the person, the cyclist, he says, school? Yes. He says, you see that shisham tree? And pointing towards that tree, several fields away, he gives the direction. It used to be there. Could you come along and show me? And the villager, he was too happy to help a city babu, that is the inspector, and he walked along with the inspector to the school, passing from various fields. His breast swelled at the thought. He felt proud walking together with the inspector. And then he praises the master, saying that he's a very good man who works very hard. The inspector of schools did not reply, and thus chasing the school across the district was now becoming a bit of drain. Means he was tired. The inspector was tired chasing the schools, sometimes in filthy towns, in wrecking localities, in remote villages where his jeep couldn't go. And it was becoming very depressing. He should have got used to it after 3 years, but no. Every school still hurt. The lack of supplies, the disinterestedness of the people, the easygoing students, and the sponging masters. It was all too much, and every recommendation which he made was shot down by the planning and development department. So they passed plowed fields and fields green with young wheat, and at one place the area was depressed and water had gathered. Now, the inspector of schools, he walked from all these muddy roads, and at last they reached the shady tree, but there was no school there, and the peasant was disappointed. He says, "It was here, I'm sure." At last time when he saw it might have shifted elsewhere, but the building, he says, there is no building. The master carries the school wherever he goes. As they stood wondering what to do, he saw a peasant working in the fields and asked. The bent figure straightened and he said, "The school has shifted near a sugarcane field." The sugarcane field was thick and rich, and now they were moving towards it. Then the inspector said, "Let me wait here and you go and look, and when you find it, let me know." The peasant strode away, laying his bicycle nearby. The inspector of school sat down on the path and looked at the brown earth and standing crop. There was not a cloud in it, and he could hear the crows crowing in distant trees. Some kites, little lazy dots, swam high in the sky, and a few birds. Soon there was a shout, and he turned, the peasant running towards him. He got up, his muscles felt stiff, and now he was ready to go along with the peasant. He led the inspector of schools to the place where he had witnessed the school. So there was a clearing among sugarcane stumps. About 40 students sat cross-legged on the bare ground, and there was not a sack mat in sight. The quiet in the clearing was especially noticeable. After the noisy passage through the field, the nodding heads were busy in memorizing tables, while others were bent over their slates and writing boards. Some boards were propped up for drying. The ink was still fresh on them, and an old man, stick in hand, sat cross legged on a chair. The chair had been repaired several times. The seat and back, once woven in rattan, were now nailed with odd slates of wood. Class 10, the monitor commanded in English. All the students scrambled up to their feet, dusting their lower fronts of kurtas. The master overcame by surprise at the presence of inspector of schools, and he took some time to collect himself. He dusted the chair and offered to the inspector of schools to sit. The peasant watched for a sign. The inspector of schools thanked him and he vanished. The master greets the inspector and feels honored. So this is the school. The inspector of schools looked around, frowning. And the master's reply was, yes, ji sir. What are you teaching them? Urdu and sums and English and writing from the prescribed books. He handed the inspector of schools the bundle of tattered and soiled books. The inspector of schools thumbed through the Urdu textbooks, stopped at a chapter and told a student to read. Sirji, the book is for 4th class. He is from 2nd. So there were 6 classes sitting, 1 to 6 all together, and a single schoolmaster. So the inspector of schools now began to differentiate between the segments that had taken as one group. The inspector of schools asked another student to read. The boy got up and began to read. His reading was clear and loud, not a mistake, not a stutter. And ask another class, Sirji, the master urged. The inspector of schools asked class 2 to do some sums. Most of the students got it right. Now he even asked a couple of students from class 1 to recite English alphabet, and they did so without any error. A student from class 6th read out a nursery rhyme, Baba Black Sheep. So what we mean to say is, even in such worse circumstances, the schoolmaster had done his duty well, and the result was the students could reply each and every question of the inspector of schools. So the class 10 shouted the monitor. His voice was louder than it had been earlier, and the inspector of schools made to leave. The master followed, stick in hand. Why do you keep shifting your school? Isn't there a room you could hire? The master replies that no one will provide us a room. They don't want a school here because they consider it as wasting of the children's time, having fun when they should be gainfully employed, helping their fathers in the fields or tending the cattle. Instead of doing that, they are simply wasting their time in the school school. So who will give them a room? But then he somehow manages to arrange a class in the fields. So the inspector of schools is now speechless. Why? Because the master says he has been asking for the plot anywhere where he can just make a room or two for the school. The inspector was silent. Already he could see the proposal rejected. The government gave no land or building for a primary school. The locals must provide that. So, a rule is a rule, and hence, after independence, it made no difference. What was good then was good now, and how many masters were as dedicated as him? How many really cared, could face such indifference? He couldn't recall one in all his 3 years. So he was helpless. He could not help the master